Welcome to the Highly Sensitive Person Podcast, a podcast for people who experience the world intensely. Join me on a journey of acceptance of our highly sensitive person traits. Welcome to the HSP Podcast. I'm your host, Kelly. Today, my guest is Andy Mort, the podcaster behind the Gentle Rebel podcast and his blog, andymort.com. I was on his show recently where we just chatted about what it's like to be an HSP and a podcaster and everything that goes along with that, and thought it would be great to have him on my show as well. Even if you aren't a podcaster, I hope you might find this interesting or insightful. Andy, thanks so much for taking the time to be on my show today. It's great to talk to you again.
Hello, Kelly. Yeah, it's fantastic to be with you. Thank you for inviting me back on.
Thrilled to have you here. I've been a fan of your blog and your podcast for such a long time. We've emailed several times, and it was funny when I was on your show. It was the first time we'd ever actually spoken. You know, it's still via Skype, but I felt like I kind of already knew you a little bit, and almost like we were friends already. So I think that's sort of a HSP thing, that kindred spirit feeling when we meet other HSPs.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we both had that thing of finishing the conversation and then being like, that's the first time we've actually spoken to one another, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. So that's such a nice thing about being highly sensitive, I think. So first, I wanted to ask you to give a little bit of background and history on your blog and your podcast. When did your podcast start, and why did you decide to start a podcast?
Well, my podcast started in one form or another in, I think it was 2010.
Wow.
When I was more focused on promoting independent music, of all things. So I was just sort of playing like local bands, under the radar sort of artists and songwriters and people. And then I began to kind of talk a little bit in between songs, and then started my blog and started exploring certain themes, just stuff that I was thinking about more than anything. And then over the years, touched on certain things that resonated on the kind of, introvert and eventually highly sensitive people topics, and then just sort of moved more exclusively in that direction. So in its current form, although I've just changed the name of the podcast, it used to be Sheep Dressed Like Wolves. The blog was sheepdressedlikewolves.com, and the podcast was the Sheep Dressed Like Wolves podcast. But I've just changed it, in the last couple of weeks to the Gentle Rebel podcast. Because that's a theme that's kind of, emerged, and something that people keep picking up on over the years as they get in touch with me. That this thing that I talk about, the gentle rebel. I think highly sensitive people are gentle rebels. I think we've got a kind of rebellious streak within us, but we're not, we're not wanting to be confrontational about it, but we want to sort of live in different ways and see the world in different ways to maybe what the norm is. And what I write about and what I talk about is along that thread of being gently rebellious, I suppose.
I like that a lot. Now that you've explained it, I like it even more. It's like the perfect encapsulation of an HSP, as a gentle rebel. So yeah, I like that. You mentioned that you have a background in music. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, always been a songwriter since I can remember, and started playing under the name Atlam Schema, which is kind of my, solo pseudonym. In about 2005, started writing music and that kind of stuff on my own. And yeah, just been, it's something that's always been a part of the way that I guess connect with the world, the way that I process the world and understand the way that I think about the world. Had a little bit of a break, I guess, over the past couple of years from doing anything too much with music. But we were in the studio at the beginning of September, recorded a little EP, so 5 new tracks. And yeah, I've got the bug again, and just really enjoying sort of getting that out there. And I'll be doing a few gigs at some point. I haven't done a gig since the beginning of 2015. So yeah, just sort of dipping my toes back in the water, and it feels quite nice.
That's really exciting to have such a wonderful creative outlet like that. And as we all know, HSPs, we really, really need to have some kind of a creative outlet. So you've been podcasting for quite a long time. You said, was it 2010 or was it around the time you started?
I think so. Yeah, it was around then.
Okay. So what has kept you going as far as your HSP related shows? Why do you keep doing it since you've been doing it for so long?
It's a very good question, because it's one of those few things that actually I do keep doing and keep on moving with, because there's a lot of things that I will try for a little while and then move on and do something else. But the podcasting has been one of those really real things of longevity for me. And I think about, what is it that keeps me recording every week? And I think it's the ability to think about the world, especially now I'm into that, the kind of understanding from the perspective, the HSP perspective. It's like I can think about the world and explore those ideas in a way that helps me. And also when I get feedback from listeners and connect with people who it helps, that is an enormous boost, because it's like, okay, this is not just for me. It's something that is changing other people's perspectives and changing their own view of themselves and all that sort of stuff. So I guess it's a mixture, really. It's like the ability to self-reflect and process, but also it's just hearing from people and feeling like, yeah, it's worth it. It's definitely worth turning that microphone on and talking.
Yeah, I totally hear you there. It's a lot of work, especially the interviews for me take me there's so many hours behind the scenes that people probably don't realize. And there have been times where I'm like, do I want to keep doing this? Like, do I have the time to do this? It's such a chunk out of my life. But then you do get the positive feedback. And let's be honest, people like to get positive feedback. It feels really good. And when people tell you that you've made a difference or helped them realize something, you don't want to stop. It feels like you'd be giving something up.
I think there's also, for me, the fact that I listen to a lot of other podcasts, and I know the kind of power and the impact that podcasts can have on my own life. And it's like, there's the kind of unspoken thing that, I very rarely reach out and talk to, like, I rarely send a message to someone whose podcast I listen to, which is something I'm like, I wish I did that more, because I would find that really nice if when people do that to me. But I just know that there are people listening who will never talk to me. And I will listen to other podcasts and never talk to a person that actually you have quite a weirdly intimate relationship with, because you're carrying them around in your ears and doing all sorts of things and doing life, and they're there with you during those moments. And you're like, yeah, I can remember listening to certain episodes of certain podcasts, and I can remember exactly what I was doing when I was listening to those episodes. And it's
Same
like,
here.
Wow. That's impactful. It's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. They actually remind me of different periods of my life too. Like there was one show I used to listen to a ton a few years ago. And when I think of that period of my life, when I think of that podcast, I remember that period in my life.
Yeah.
It's kind of like an odor. Like when you smell a certain perfume, you remember the person who wore it or the time in your life.
Yeah. With fragrances, with odors, I remember reading something that said the power of smell is more powerful than the power of like looking at a photograph in terms of memory.
Oh, really?
And that actually, it stimulates something in your brain that is profoundly brings you to that memory with more clarity than even if you were to look at a photograph, which is, I think there's probably something similar with sound as well. Because I remember there was a period of time where I was listening to a specific podcast, and it was when I used to do like loads of different odd jobs and stuff. And one of them was cleaning, and I'd always listen to this one podcast while I was cleaning. And it just so tied up with the memory of doing that. You just have to listen to the opening music of the podcast, and it's like, whoa, I'm there suddenly,
Yeah. And since you brought up positive feedback, I wanted to ask you about negative feedback. Now, inevitably, we all get criticism. It doesn't matter who you are or how amazing your show is or what you do. There's always going to be criticism or negative feedback. And especially as HSPs, it can be tough to deal with that. So I was wondering if you could talk a little about that. If you've gotten negative feedback, what kind of things did people say? And how did you deal with it?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, as you say, we all get negative feedback. And I think we interpret feedback that's, slightly over the tipping point. It's not necessarily intended to be negative, but we will read it more negative than it actually is. So, I mean, one of the things that I do, if there's something that seems like negative feedback, is I'll read it and then I'll say, right, I'm going to give it some space and then come back and read it, try and be a bit more objective in the way that I read it, and come back in a few hours or maybe tomorrow or whatever. And usually it's not quite as bad as it seems on first reading.
Yeah, I've definitely gotten some bad feedback. I think I got one of the most generic, hateful feedback comments, I think, was "go kill yourself."
Oh, man.
And that's just like, what kind of person, like, what state of mind are you in if you're writing this on a blog? Like, how could anything I ever say make you that angry? You know what I mean? It just makes me wonder about that person. And obviously, I don't take it personally because it's such a weird comment.
There's negative feedback that's kind of intended to be criticism and maybe sort of direct you in a different way, in a way that they want you to go. And there's that sort of thing, which is just like, you probably haven't actually listened to like an episode of the podcast. You just, you get off on just telling people to kill themselves. So
I think what you said is so perfect. If anyone out there is struggling with criticism, is exactly what you said, is give it some time. And I have to remind myself that too. Like, I read it, and of course, instantly I feel like my whole body is kind of like goes on alert. Like, oh my gosh, somebody's criticizing me. What do I do? Or I want to write back because I'm angry or whatever it is. I have to give it like a day, and then I think so much differently about it.
Just thinking about an example similar to what you were saying, negative feedback on, I produced a YouTube video, which was basically a general introduction to the concept of what a highly sensitive person is. And that receives a lot of views still now. I did it a couple of years ago, I think. But some of YouTube's notoriously bad for it, but some of the comments on there are just, you can take them very personally. But I've noticed something. I generally don't, I won't get involved in comments on it, because you often see other people slotting in and kind of responding to the battle for you, or on behalf of all of us, you know.
Yeah, standing up for
because
you.
Yeah, and because most of the negative feedback comes from people who haven't watched the video. I think it's called "What is a Highly Sensitive Person" or something like that, and they've just interpreted what they think the video is going to say based on the title, and so they spout all this stuff off about, you just need to like man up and get over yourself and be less sensitive, blah 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 blah. And yet clearly, because actually the answer's in the video, that's not what we're talking about with highly sensitive, the trait at all anyway. So it sort of dwells in your mind, doesn't it? Even when you give it that space, it's just there. I'll just go about my day and be like, why am I feeling a little bit kind of negative, a little bit down? And it's like, I can trace it back to that, that one word in that email that I read this morning. I get it from even stuff that's nothing to do. Like if I read a piece of news on a website or something that is something that I'm like, that makes me feel quite sort of sick about the world or something, that can have a profound effect as well. And I often have to think, okay, why am I feeling like this? I need to kind of filter that.
Yeah, you mentioned YouTube. I purposely avoided YouTube. I don't need people criticizing my appearance or my face or whatever. Inevitably, unless you're perfect looking, someone's going to be like, you're ugly or whatever. And I just I don't feel like dealing with that. Yeah. I do put the audio of my shows on YouTube, but I just feel like I just have no interest in having my face on YouTube. And just in general, I don't feel like dealing with the criticism.
Well, funny you should say that, because the video I was talking about was, it's like a series of drawings that I did to illustrate certain points. And, I can't really draw. So when I put it up, it was like, I've had a little bit of creative inspiration, excuse the awful drawings. But inevitably some of the comments are like, you should close down your channel and learn to draw, or stop drawing, or, it's focused on that rather than anything else, the message behind it. And it's kind of like, and I found myself like being really offended by that. And I was like, hold on a second. I don't pretend to be able to draw. It was just that's not a personal attack against anything that I aspire to do. So just let go of it, So because you have a blog and a podcast, how do you feel about those two versus each other? Like the different impact that they have,
or also versus different media like social media, what do you think has the biggest impact for you or the biggest reach? And what do you like working on more?
Very good question. I've come to enjoy podcasting more than writing blog posts actually now. I think it used to be the other way around until I kind of, I guess, gained confidence and enjoyed the process of putting podcasts together, which did take quite a long time. I mean, the first episodes that I did back when I was doing the music shows, I'd do the little links in between songs, and I would do about 10 to 15 takes, and listen back each time and be like, I sound like an idiot. I need to change something slightly. I mean, and it's that whole thing, isn't it, of when you hear your own voice and you're like, that's a horrible thing to listen to.
Yes.
But then, over time, you sort of become more confident behind the mic, and more accepting of what comes out, of the speakers. And so, I enjoy doing that now. And I think it gives more freedom in terms of being able to say a little bit more, although this is something we discussed, wasn't it? Your ability to do very pithy, short episodes really impresses me. And that is something that I really wish I could do. You're very, very good at making a point succinctly.
Thank you.
Which is what I do with a blog post more than a podcast. But in terms of my sort of previous episodes, there are certain blog posts that are more successful than any of the episodes of the podcast, in terms of attracting, I guess, traffic, through search engines and that kind of thing. But the podcast has definitely picked up I think podcasting generally has. There seems to have been a wider increase in people listening to podcasts over the past, I don't know, year or two.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that with my own. I've seen the numbers rise, I think, because of that more than anything.
Yeah, I think it's way more mainstream now. It used to be kind of this like weird counterculture thing to listen to podcasts, and now I feel like pretty much everyone listens to them, or at least doesn't think it's weird anymore.
Exactly. Yeah, and I guess because a lot of radio shows, mainstream radio shows now are available to re-listen to as podcasts as well, aren't they? So it has definitely entered the mainstream in a big way.
Yeah, I started all of my stuff as my HSP blog way before I had the podcast. And now that I've had the podcast for a while, it's really strange. It's almost like I've started to neglect the blog a little bit. I feel like I get more feedback from the episodes, and it's a little more forgiving. Like when you're talking, everything doesn't have to be perfect when I'm writing. Yeah. Obviously, I want things to be a lot better and to be written nicely. So blog posts take such a long time, and I don't feel like there's as much feedback. It's just interesting to see how things have shifted. I never thought the podcast would have as much reach as it does. So it's kind of incredible. So on that note, if there's anyone listening to this who's thinking that they want to start a podcast, what kind of advice would you give to those people?
I'd say just sort of do it. Really. It's something that you can overthink and really get caught in the details, both in terms of the technology of it, what equipment you've got to have to be able to start. You can record literally on a mobile phone. You can record an episode of a podcast. Like on my iPhone, I've done audio on that, and it's not terrible. I mean, it's not great, but it's not unlistenable. And so, don't let that get in your way. If you've got no budget, then you'll still be able to start, technologically speaking. And also, in terms of what you're going to talk about, have an idea, but don't get really stressed about having the perfect elevator pitch and all that sort of stuff, because it just evolves over time. And enjoy the fact that at the beginning, nobody will listen. I always say, enjoy the obscurity, the period of obscurity when you're actually able to, just explore what it is that you want to say and the way that you're saying it. And you can grow. At the beginning, you grow. It's like, I find when I started swimming, doing sort of 10 lengths was really, really painful. But then very quickly, that became a lot easier. I could just sort of reel off 40 lengths and it wouldn't be painful after about 2 weeks. And I think the growth of, your confidence and what you're going to be saying and all that sort of stuff. It works in a very similar way. You have a quick trajectory up of just working it all out, working out what you're going to do. You can do that while no one's listening, and that is good, because I think you can get bogged down in, people are like, oh, you want to be new and noteworthy, you've got to get on that, you've got to launch in a massive way and get everybody listening. And it's like, I think that's a really bad idea, because you will either you're not there yet, you don't have, it's not good enough for that, or like you'll put everything into those first couple of episodes, making them perfect, and then you're like, how can I keep up with that? It's impossible to, the workload that's required to produce amazing quality is kind of too much to maintain at the beginning.
That's some really good advice. When I wanted to start my podcast, I put it off for months and months and months, always thinking like, well, I'm not ready, or it's not going to be good enough. And finally one day I had bought an okay microphone. I'm like, Kelly, just record a darn episode. Like, who cares? Don't care about anything. It might be horrible. Just sit down and do it. And because I kept putting it off because things weren't going to be good enough in my mind. And it ended up being not nearly as horrible as I thought. So if you are thinking of starting one, you just have to sit down and record. And yes, you're going to hate the way your voice sounds. Everyone hates the way their voice sounds. And I would, something else I would add is, if you want to start a show, think about what your goal is. I think a lot of people just kind of get excited about having a podcast, the idea of having a podcast, like, hey, me and a bunch of friends are just going to sit around and talk about movies because we're so funny when we have discussions. That's so true. Yeah. That's the stereotype of, like a new podcast. And that's fine if it's something fun that you want to do. But if it's something you're taking a little more seriously, think about, where do I want this to go? What is my goal? Am I trying to turn this into a business, or is this a supplement to a hobby or a business that I do? Something like that, because a lot of shows just fizzle out, which is fine. But if you don't want to fizzle out, maybe plan a little into the future so it's sustainable to keep it going.
Definitely. Yeah. You've got to have a reason, which is more than because I'm going to start a podcast because I've been told that's what you've got to do now. Yeah. It's like, well, that's not going to last very long if that's your reason for doing it.
So that kind of leads me to another topic that's sometimes a little awkward to talk about, and that is money and making money. I think that a lot of listeners of podcasts, even myself, before I started doing it myself, I didn't like the idea of podcasts making money or having ads or asking for money because it seemed inauthentic, which is partly an HSP thing. Authenticity is big for us. We like to feel like people are being true and honest and real. Now, of course, I realize that expecting someone to do something for free is just unfair, because people need to, or most of the time they need to, make money for the work they do and the massive amount of time that they're putting into something. So I don't know why I held that against somebody, but I do run across that nowadays, that people get a little irritated when they feel like you're trying to run an ad or make money, and it's like, man, I gotta make money just like you do. And it's just reality. I wish I didn't have to, but I do. So what do you think of all this as far as monetization, and what have you done?
Well, I totally identify with both the feeling that way about making money, and also having people complain if they think that you're trying to make money.
Yeah, like, why aren't you doing this for free?
Exactly. And because, I mean, I've got a day job as well, and I still think it's really important to, I guess, make things sustainable with the blog, with the podcast. It costs a lot of money to maintain, to just have the infrastructure of a blog and a podcast, from month to month. People don't quite realize that. And, a mailing list as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have to pay to keep all those email addresses.
Exactly. And I always think like, when you get unsubscribes after you send out an email blast.
You're like, yes.
And it's like, oh, thank you.
If you don't want to be on my list, I don't want you. You're taking up space that I have to pay for.
Exactly. So that's nice. But, it's kind of a mixed blessing. Yeah. But, in terms of monetization, one of the things that I always try and remember is something Danny Inney once said when I was interviewing him for the Haven, which my community would talk about in a bit. He said on this topic, like, business is about, I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was basically, he sees business as a way to make impact sustainable. That really struck me, because it was like, yeah, that makes sense, because actually when you're paying for something, you're making the thing that you want able to exist for longer or sustainably. And actually, you know, if you're paying for a podcast presenter to keep their podcast going, that's what you're paying for. You know, you want it to exist, and you want it to grow and improve. And that's what that's why it's important, because as you said, no one can kind of just continue creating in a vacuum without being able to fund it and without making a living and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I think it's really important to kind of hold that in mind. And in terms of how I've monetized the podcast, with the podcast itself, it's just I created a Patreon page, as I know you have as well.
Yes.
And it's totally non-exclusive, so you don't get anything if you pledge to give to keep it going. But I mean, what I say is you just make the running costs self-sustaining and all that. And actually people do. And it really, really surprises me, and just makes me like, this is amazing, because people respond to the podcast even though they have absolutely no reason to whatsoever, and they want to give financially to help keep it going in that way. And so, yeah, it's only a small amount each month or each episode, but I don't know, it just makes me smile every time I go on there and hit publish. I'm like, you guys, this is amazing.
It is incredible that they just, of their own accord, like they were just moved enough or felt moved to contribute something financially. It really is incredible and touching. So you mentioned the Haven a few moments ago, so I really wanted to chat about that. Anyone who's listened to a lot of my shows, you've probably heard me talk about it before, because I have promoted the Haven several times before. And this is Andy's online community for highly sensitive people. I have a lot of people who leave comments or ask me questions about where can they find a community of other HSPs. They just want to be around other people like them and ask questions and learn more things. So the Haven, in my mind, is the best place to do that. And I believe it's going to be reopening its doors soon from November 4th to 10th. If you happen to be listening to this in a timely fashion, you might catch it in that window. And you can go sign up to be a part of the Haven at my special link at highlysensitiveperson.net/Haven. But I would love for Andy to, if you could tell us a little bit more about the Haven and why it's so great and why people should join.
Yeah, well, it's, as you say, a community for highly sensitive people. And really I was inspired to start it because, there are resources for highly sensitive people out there, and on Facebook particular, because the part of this is it's got a secret Facebook group. But I noticed there was a lot of it's very, I don't know, it doesn't feel safe to kind of just be there to ask questions, to make comments. It feels like a real risk to do that in certain places. So I wanted to create a kind of safe community where that could happen, and everybody's on the same kind of page and really wanting to support one another. And so that's a really significant part of what the Haven is, as well as I kind of produce weekly content exploring different themes each month, basically moving from coping with an overwhelming, a noisy world as a highly sensitive person to a place where we're kind of thriving as highly sensitive people, and doing what it is that is kind of, chiming at our hearts and the things that we really want to do. There's a concept that Laurie Helgo talks about in her book, Introvert Power. And she says there are often two kinds of introverts. There's the shadow dweller and there's the accessible introvert. And this is how we respond to the kind of the norm of the world, the extrovert ideal, if you will, where it's kind of, it values gregariousness and being popular and all this sort of stuff, and puts these extrinsic values on how you kind of behave and act as a human. And obviously, as we've said, this kind of gentle rebel thing is we have this ulterior, this other way of thinking about the world, these other values that I think many highly sensitive people have. But she talks about the kind of response to kind of feeling like there's something wrong with you as you interact and are orientated to the world in a different way to what might be promoted or accepted. Kind of inspiring, pushing us towards this where we're shadow dwelling and kind of take ourselves outside of society. We're looking in and we're thinking, I'm different from that, and not getting involved and alienating from the world. Or the accessible introvert, she says, is this idea of just kind of merging within it and trying to pretend to be like everybody else, to be that thing that you're not, and essentially alienating yourself from yourself. And so for me, that was a huge concept in how I think about what we're doing in the Haven. It's kind of finding another option. It's to thrive as highly sensitive people in the world. It's not hiding from the world. It's not kind of succumbing to the pressures that you feel from the world. It's finding our own path and our own unique way of interacting with the world as highly sensitive people. And I think the best way to do that is in community and sort of exploring it together, so that then we have a better understanding of ourselves and what is important to us and the things that we want to do. Essentially, that's a roundabout way of explaining it.
I think that's a great description of why we need a safe place. You don't have to worry about someone and coming in and saying horrible things to you. If you dare to make it known to the world that you're sensitive and ask questions about it, no one's going to come and criticize you. So it's safe. And then you also have this warm, great feeling of community and other people who understand you, which we all love. Everyone loves that. It's just wonderful. And you've done a great job with it. So I am more than happy to talk about it every time you do open it up, a couple times a year. Like I said, between November 4th and 10th, 2016, go to highlysensitiveperson.net/haven. And you can sign up and try the first month for just $1 and check it out and see what you think. So there's not really anything to risk. Andy, thanks so much for taking the time to come and chat with me today about everything related to podcasting and having a blog about the HSP world. I really appreciate you sharing your experience.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
You can find links to the Gentle Rebels podcast and Andy's social media at the show notes for this episode at highlysensitiveperson.net/episode 71. While at my website, you can also sign up for the newsletter and be notified of new podcast episodes, blog posts, and interesting HSP news. Thanks so much for listening.